Structure of imagery in the Bible, and we've been looking at various categories of it, the paradisal, and then below that the organization of the animal world, which on one occasion gives us the Garden of Eden, and on the other the pastoral world, more particularly of the sheepfold. And of course, pastoral and garden imagery have overlapped both in biblical and secular literature all through the history of human imagination. And it's easy to see in such things as the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, how the pastoral ideal and the paradisal ideal really blend together and form the same thing. Now I'll be filling up various stages of this table as we come to them, but there's the intervening category of the human world, which is a much more complicated one. Now, if we ask, what is the ideal human form for existence, we find that there is no simple or single answer, because our answers keep shuttling between a social ideal and an individual ideal. That is, if we think of human ideals, they are a paradoxical mixture of a belonging and an escape. According to Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is other people, but I'm not sure that Sartre would want to spend the whole of eternity by himself, richly rewarding as that would perhaps be. And similarly, Marvel can write a poem on the garden, which is really on the paradisal imagery of the Bible, in which he suggests that the fall of man really began when a stupid and blundering God created Eve in order to be a second person and a companion for Adam. And as he says, two paradises 'twere in one, to live in paradise alone. But you cannot think of a human ideal consistently, either in social terms or in individual terms. So we seem to be in a deadlock, and the only solution is that human life, like Greek nouns, seems to have a dual as well as a singular and a plural. So we have the individual life, the sexual, the erotic relation between two people, and the social. And the sexual one is given an emphasis in the Bible, which, like so many things in the Bible, are unintelligible in anything but metaphorical terms. We are told that in the sexual relation, two people are actually the same person while remaining two people, which is not possible, but is therefore the cornerstone of biblical imagery. And so that the ideal of human life becomes an ideal in which the sexual relationship has become the pattern for the identification of the individual and the social. And the imagery of a wedding, of the union of the bridegroom and the bride, is one of Jesus' own favorite images for the apocalyptic or ideal world. And it is essential to realize that in this case, the bride is actually the entire following of Christians. And in the book of Revelation, it is identified with Jerusalem or Israel, meaning the people of God. Now that suggests, first of all, that sexual imagery has relatively little to do with the actual relations of men and women. That is, in this relationship where Christ is the bridegroom and the bride are the people of Christ, it follows that Christ is the only, symbolically, the only male. He is also symbolically the only individual, the only person with the right to say, I am. That means that the souls of the people of God, whether they are souls of men or of women, are all symbolically female and make up a single bride figure. Any question that far then? Now, again, metaphorical thinking is not logical thinking, and we have to proceed with a sets of identifications that we would find it hard to follow in other categories. But that is the way in which the human imagery of the Bible is linked together. Could you look at the Song of Songs in the Old Testament? The Song of Songs is a series of wedding songs in which both the bridegroom and the bride are represented. They both have their songs. And the opening verse says, the Song of Song, which is Solomon's. Now, there's no more reason for ascribing the authorship of the Song of Songs to Solomon than there is for ascribing it to the Witch of Endor. But the poem is symbolically associated with Solomon because the symbolism expands the songs from songs about probably a rural wedding where the bride is called sister, which is the conventional Oriental term for the loved one, and expands that into a symbolic wedding of the king with the land over which he rules. That is why the bride describes herself as black but comely. That is, she represents the black fertile soil of the land. And she is compared, her body is compared to different aspects of the land of Israel. And we are told that her that her body is to be compared to various aspects of the country. And her nose, for example, is as a tower of Lebanon that looketh towards Damascus, which might seem to be a rather doubtful compliment to a bride whose charms were less symbolic. But the wedding of the king and the fertile land is an image for what the word testament itself indicates. The word that we translate as testament, which is berith in Hebrew and diatheke in Greek, means a covenant or a contract, and it means specifically the contract between God and his people Israel, so that Solomon and his bride, the Shulamite woman of the Song of Songs, expands by a further range of symbolism into the relationship of God and his people, which is why in Christian typology, the Song of Songs was interpreted as a song of the love of Christ for his bride, for his people. Of course, Christianity was a big city religion which expanded from one city to another, and consequently the image of the black fertile land is not as immediate in Christianity as it is in Judaism, but the same symbolic shape is nevertheless there. And if you look at Isaiah 62, you see the same prophecy being applied to the restored Israel. In the 4th verse, thou shalt no more be termed forsaken, neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate, but thou shalt be called Hephzibah, and thy land Beulah. For the Lord delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married, which is the meaning of the word Beulah. And the image of the land married to its king expands into the image of the people of God married to its God. Now, if we put this closer to the center of the blackboard, we can perhaps get either the other side of the imagery in. In the demonic world, the demonic counterpart of the bride would be the figure described in the book of Revelation as the great whore, and the male figure, of which she is the mistress, would be the figure opposed to Christ, who in the New Testament is described as Antichrist. And just as the bride is identified with Jerusalem, so the whore would be identified with the heathen city, Babylon. Can you look at the 17th chapter of Revelation? Chapter 17 is in verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. And then in verse 5, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And later on, in verse 9, she is associated with 7 mountains, which are clearly the 7 hills of Caesarean Rome. So that Babylon and Rome are, that is the Rome of the persecuting Caesars, are symbolically the same demonic city, where the power opposed to that of Christianity is established. It's important perhaps to realize that the word whore in the Bible almost always refers to theological and not to sexual irregularity. That is, a person who is associated with whores in the Old Testament is Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, and that is not because she is supposed to have cuckolded King Ahab. The narrator of Kings could hardly have cared whether she did or not, but because she introduced the worship of Baal into Israel. And the reason for the epithet, apart from the symbolic contrast to bride, is not just that it's abusive, but it has a more specific reference to the custom in Canaanite religion of maintaining prostitutes in the temple, which is a practice that the Israelites in Deuteronomy are forbidden to have anything to do with, but which was obviously extremely familiar to them. If you look at the story of Tamar, for example, in Genesis, Tamar disguises herself as a cult prostitute in order to get back her inheritance as a forsaken wife. And the story would be unintelligible if the practice were not familiar to Israel as well as to the surrounding nations. Antichrist, in his turn, is the secular ruler, and as a society grows from tribal communities into nations, and from nations into empires, the ruler of the empire tends to think of himself as the ruler of the world. And the Bible does not regard the world ruler as necessarily an evil person, but he rules over the kind of world in which sooner or later one of his descendants is going to become so. So that Jesus' axiom about spiritual and temporal authority render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, runs into a difficulty as soon as Caesar begins to claim what is due only to God, that is, divine worship. And it's only when he does that that he becomes an Antichrist figure. And that figure is referred to in both one of Paul's letters and in the book of Revelation itself. And in the book of Revelation, the Antichrist is characterized in a cipher. The cipher is the number 666. And ciphers of that kind usually turn on the fact that the letters of the alphabet were also used as numbers. And there has never been a cipher in history solved as often as that one has been. It has been solved in Hebrew, it's been solved in Greek, and it's been solved by Robert Graves in Latin. And it always, or at least apparently, nearly always at any rate, spells out the name of Nero, who is the type of the persecuting emperor. He was the first emperor to institute a persecution of Jews and Christians, according to Tacitus, in order to have somebody to blame for the burning of Rome. And although the author of Revelation probably lived under a later emperor, still Nero is the type. And as the type, he is spiritually, that is metaphorically, identical with other persecuting figures in the Bible, such as Antiochus, who is the villain of the book of Daniel, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? That leads to a more comprehensive picture of female figures in the Bible that we might look at this point. I've been dividing images into the apocalyptic or ideal and the demonic. Those are a contrast. There are also intermediate figures who represent human nature in the sense that they are neither wholly evil nor ideal, but are imperfect figures undergoing the process of redemption. And you can divide the female figures of the Bible into two groups, the maternal and the marital, that is, the mother figures and the bride figures. And over on this side, the maternal figures include the Virgin Mary and a mysterious woman who appears in the book of Revelation, at the beginning of Revelation 12, and who is said to be a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. She's a queen of heaven, like so many maternal goddesses, but she is also described as the mother of the Messiah, like the Virgin Mary. So that there are really three accounts of the birth of the Messiah in the New Testament. The one in Matthew, which has the wise men and has Jesus born in a house, and the one in Luke, the pastoral one, which has the shepherds and has him born in a manger, and this account here in chapter 12, which is so obviously mythical and metaphorical that it has never succeeded in getting on our Christmas cards. But in any case, there is a second maternal figure And in the intermediate category, you have the specifically human mother, who, of course, is Eve, our general mother, as Milton calls her, who is the representative of humanity going through sin and redemption, and also Rachel, who, though only one of the wives of Jacob or Israel, is symbolically the mother of Israel, and is so referred to in Matthew in the connection with the slaughter of the innocents. And bride figures would then include the bride of the Song of Songs and the Jerusalem bride, who appears at the end of the book of Revelation, chapter 21, where it is said that she is the holy city, the New Jerusalem, descending to earth as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, there doesn't appear to be a demonic maternal figure, but this blackboard demands one, and we often find that if the Bible does not supply what is needed diagrammatically, it will invariably be supplied by later legend. So later legend obliged by constructing the figure of Lilith. Now, Lilith is mentioned in Isaiah. It's Isaiah 34, I think. And the King James Version calls her a screech owl, which is one of the bad things that the Authorized Version is continually doing, that is, making rationalized translations. But in later legend, Lilith became the first wife of Adam. There are two accounts of creation in the book of Genesis, and the effort to reconcile those two accounts wound up by giving Adam two wives, the first one being Lilith and the second Eve. And Lilith, we are told, was the mother of all the demons and the fallen angels. And being that, she had a very flourishing career in romantic literature, and she appears in Goethe's Faust and as the heroine of a romance of George MacDonald and many other places. And the marital figure is, of course, the great whore of Revelation, identified with Babylon as the other one is with Jerusalem, and with such Old Testament prototypes as Jezebel introducing the cult of Baal. It follows, therefore, that there needs to be an intermediate marital figure, and that intermediate figure would represent the human race going through the process of sin and redemption. Now, we've said that the word we translate testament has the other meaning of, or at least it has the primary meaning, of covenant or contract between God and his people. The contract is represented as something drawn up by God's initiative with Israel. It is also represented as a contract which God could break, but won't break because of his nature, but as a contract which man, strictly speaking, cannot break, but is forever trying to break. So that symbolically, the female figure of this category here would be the forgiven harlot. That is, the bride figure who is unfaithful to her Lord, but who, in spite of that, is to be forgiven and brought back again. Now, that harlot figure appears in various parts of the Old Testament. Ezekiel, for example, in chapter 16, and verse 3, "Thus saith the Lord God unto Jerusalem, Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan, thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother an Hittite," and so on. And the whole chapter goes on to describe the unfaithfulness of Jerusalem and yet her forgiveness. The Canadian poet James Rainey has a poem called Rachel, which is, in effect, a very beautiful and very eloquent paraphrase of this chapter in Ezekiel. And the same image turns up later in Hosea, where Hosea is ordered by God to marry two harlots, one after the other, and they represent the apostasy of both North and South Israel. And the same figure turns up in the New Testament under the name usually identified as Mary Magdalene. There is an anonymous woman in the 7th chapter of Luke described as a sinner whose sins are forgiven because she loved much. And Mary Magdalene appears in the next chapter of Luke and is generally identified with her. And another similar female who has the same symbolic role, whether she's the same person or not, has firmly established squatters' rights on the opening of the 8th chapter of John. She is actually a bit of floating folklore associated with Jesus, and in the early manuscript she appears in various places, and the modern translators of the Bible, who are much more distinguished for scholarship than for common sense, tend to try to get her out of John the 8th and put her in an appendix. But nevertheless, she's still there, and she represents perhaps one of the most eloquent and moving episodes of the gospel. The woman who, because she was a harlot, is condemned to be stoned to death, and Jesus interferes and suggests that those who have never committed any sins at all might take the lead in throwing the stones. And hence, in paintings of the crucifixion, you usually see the cross of Christ flanked by the two female figures, the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, one in blue and the other in red. In a polytheistic mythology, you can have the maternal figure and the bridal figure identified. That is, you can have a female goddess figure who is both the mother of a god and later on his mistress. You get that in the cults associated with dying gods in Mediterranean countries, and you have such counterparts as the relations, say, of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus with the relation of Venus and Cupid in classical mythology, where Venus is the mother of the god of love. And Venus can also be a bride figure as well as several other things. And in Christianity, however, the two figures of the mother and the bride obviously have to be separated, although they are still very close together symbolically. The bride of the Song of Songs, for example, is described as a garden enclosed and a fountain sealed, or as the Vulgate says, hortus conclusus fons signatus. And the garden enclosed and the fountain sealed has always been traditionally identified with the Virgin Mary, who, from one symbolic point of view, is the bride of the Holy Spirit as well as the mother of the Logos. And we are also told that Christ is the son of a father, who is a spiritual father, and that his death reconciles man with the Father. Now, if you constructed a demonic parody of all that, you would get something very close to the story of Oedipus, who kills his father and makes a wife out of his mother. And the status of the Oedipus story as a kind of demonic parody of the Christian story was striking enough for the poet Yeats to construct an elaborate theory of history according to which civilizations of Oedipus and civilizations of a Christ figure alternate all through time, one being tragic and heroic, the other comic and altruistic. But it's perhaps easier to see the Oedipus story as either a demonic parody of the Christian story, as it is in some aspects, or as an intermediate analogy of it, as it is in certain other aspects. In the story of the creation of Adam, for example, the older story, which begins in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, the Yahwist account as it's called, Adam is made from a female Adama, or Mother Earth. And when he is told after the fall that he goes back to the ground from which he was taken, he returns to that Earth Mother after making the break with his father, so that the Oedipus legend is not quite removed from the story of Adam itself. Any question that far? Well, this account of the human symbolism in the Bible is, of course, closely linked to the account of city symbolism, because the city is the emblem of the people, of the group. So if you go to the urban image, you have Jerusalem on the one side and Babylon on the other. And that brings us up again against the question of the ambiguity between the social image and the individual image. Now, there's another dimension of this relation of the social to the individual, of the class or group to the individual, which we've already run into. We saw that the paradisal imagery of the Bible is, in the first place, a garden, and in the second place, a single tree, a tree of life. And that leads to a general principle of imagery in the Bible, a special kind of metaphor where the individual is identified with the class or group of things to which it belongs. That is the type of metaphor that I sometimes call a royal metaphor, because it underlies one of the most pervasive of human institutions, the institution of kingship. We've already seen how the king, Solomon, inevitably interposes himself in the symbolic expansion of the Song of Songs. And similarly, Elizabeth II can draw crowds wherever she appears, not because there is anything remarkable about her appearance, but because she dramatizes the metaphor of society as a single body. And that has been the function of the king in all ages, to represent in an individual form the unity of his society. So that the corporate or class image, like the city, would also be, on the principles of this royal metaphor, identified with a single building. And that building would most naturally be the house consecrated to the city's god, which stands in the middle of it. In other words, the temple, so that the city is the bride and the temple is the bridegroom. We're told several times in the Gospels that the temple is to be identified with the body of Christ. And in the Gospels, Jesus is represented as saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the narrator adds that he was speaking of the temple of his body. But the author of Revelation, in describing the New Jerusalem, is very emphatic that there was no temple therein, because, as he explains, the place of the temple has been taken by the body of God. So that there is, in this metaphorical symbolism, the unity of the bridegroom and the bride, in which all the buildings of the city are one building, a house of many mansions, And the corresponding demonic image is, of course, the Tower of Babel. All right? Yeah.
Do the images of the city all have intermediate corresponding?
Sorry?
The metaphor of the city, they have intermediate city.
Well, the intermediate one would be the earthly Jerusalem, which keeps falling and rising in the image of human catastrophe and redemption.
The Tower of Babel appears in Genesis.
Yeah.
Does it appear in any other time?
Not specifically, so far as I know, but it's the image of a building of a particular kind. That is, the builders of the Tower of Babel want to put up a building that will reach to heaven. Now, that's an ambitious architectural project, but remember that the sacred temple that houses the god is always symbolically a building which does reach heaven. And similarly, Jerusalem, which is set on a hill, a great deal of symbolic importance is attached to that hill, and that means that Jerusalem is symbolically at the highest point of the world. Jerusalem, whither the tribes go up, as it says in the Psalms. Everybody goes up to Jerusalem, and the temple, consequently, would be the highest point in the earth and the connecting link with heaven. And while the Tower of Babel itself is not referred to as such in the prophets, you do get images of rivals of the true God sitting on tops of mountains which are so high that they are actually in the stars. And the best known example of that is the identification of the king of Babylon in Isaiah with Lucifer, the planet Venus, which has set his domination on the top of a mountain in the north, which is the rival to the Jerusalem on the hill. Well, I want to go on with some of the complications of that next day then.